Hello. In this video we're going to take an exam question based on the character of Inspector Goole and we're going to plan a developed response to it. We're going to think about a few ideas, tonking in a dash of context, a pinch of analysis and interpretation. Then we're going to stir it all together and serve up a banquet of beautifully crafted exam paragraphs, guaranteed to be very much to the examiner's refined tastes. Now I've whittled down for you here the examiner's criteria. In the mark scheme, that man, he chunders on for about 4 pages, but I've managed to boil it down into 3 sentences, and this is what the examiner is using to judge you. Let's have a look. There is a thorough engagement with task. Response looks at various episodes or incidents in the play where the cited theme or character is presented. The magic number here, I would say, folks, is 3 to 6. 3 to 6 ideas or points expressed in this essay will be enough to satisfy an examiner. And you're going to see later, I'm only going to lay on 3 ideas. But because I analyse them in such eye-watering depth, you can bet the farm that is going to be more than enough to satisfy the examiner. A quick nose at that second line now. In a sustained critical style, intelligent interpretations stem from appropriate textual references. The critical style just means avoid slang, apply that high-level lexis, those big words like capitalism and socialism, perhaps laissez-faire, Edwardian. Make sure you're doing it accurately and appropriately, though. If you feel that you're just tossing big words about in a bid to sound intelligent and informed, I'd advise against that. I don't want to sound patronising. I'd go for the simpler word. You really want to foreground clarity over highfalutin language. So just bear that in mind. And finally, of course, you've got to link the text with contextual factors in a sustained and effective way. So linking to the era when it was written, 1945, the era when it was set, the Edwardian era, 1912. Again, here's a chance to bandy around some big words like Edwardian, post-war Britain, capitalism, socialism, what have you. Make sure it's relevant context. Priest was born in 1894, big whoop, nobody cares. The sort of thing that you might want to toss in is the fact that he served in World War I, and maybe this fostered a resentment towards the ruling class, which manifests in this play. Make sure your details of context are relevant, otherwise you're wasting everyone's time. So let's look at the exam question that this video intends to tackle. It's based on an Edexcel question from the 2017 spec onwards, but I dare say it applies to many other exam boards. Let's have a look. In what ways does Inspector Goole have an effect on other characters in the play? You must refer to the context of the play in your answer, and for Edexcel they give you 50 minutes, 40 marks, and 8 of those marks are for the quality of your spelling, your punctuation and your grammar. So this is the ugly critter that we're going to be wrestling with today. First thing we need to do is hack it down to size by identifying the key words. This will give us a clear idea of what the examiner wants from us. So I've been out with my tin of green emulsion and I've done just that. I've highlighted what I see as the key words in this question. Now where it says what ways, obviously this question is about Inspector Goole. This part of the question is making me think, well, what does Goole say or do that has an effect on other characters? What ways, what does the character do or say? Where in the text does this happen? Inspector Goole, obviously, he's the focus of this character-based question, and what we're looking at in particular, the key phrase, or the key words, if you will, is how Inspector Goole has an effect on other characters. What influence, impact, how does he affect other people in this play? And finally, of course, I've just spray-painted context too, because I have to link to the era it was written, anything I know about Priestley that's relevant, and anything I know about the era it was set. So you've got 50 minutes to plan and execute a response to this question. This is how I would break down my time, but I guarantee your teacher is no noddy. If their timings differ, I would defer to them. This is just how I, personally, Mr. Taylor, tackles these timings. I'd spend 10 to 15 minutes on a plan. Never underestimate the benefits of good planning. It really is your ticket to a higher mark. So that's why I'm spending a lot of time doing it. After that, I'm going to spend about half an hour, maybe 35 minutes, turning those ideas into silky sweet paragraphs. And finally, because I'm marked for my spag, my spelling punctuation, I'm going to spend a good 5 minutes tooth combing over everything I've written to make sure it makes sense and that it all hangs together very nicely. So let's start planning our response to this question on the ways that Inspector Goole affects other characters in the play. And we're going to take our cue from the great Noel Gallagher. Sadly, the only thing I have in common with this man is that we're both vaguely feral-looking Mancunians, but this musical genius once said in his song Master Plan, take some time to make some sense of what you want to say. And that is exactly why we plan. We marshal our thoughts, we husband our resources, we think carefully before we start writing those paragraphs. And here's my first idea. Goole seeks to unsettle the Burling family. The next step, of course, is to come up with some evidence from the text, a reference or a quotation, to back up that initial point or assertion. And it always makes me queasy because he's always honking on about the effects of the corrosive chemicals on the human body, is Inspector Goole. So he's always reminding us that when Eva glugged the bleach, it burnt her insides out, of course. Ugh. Is that word for word the correct quotation? I don't know. I haven't got the text in front of me. But then again, neither will you in the exam. And this is one place where the examiner is quite benign. He will cut you a lot of slack for misquoting. As long as you're getting the gist of it right, he'll accept that. So I've got a point, backed up with evidence. Next step, let's lay on an explanation or an interpretation for this evidence. And I'm saying here that when Goole is honking on about the effects of the bleach on the body, what he's seeking to do there is to shock the Burlings. He wants to shock them into rejecting their selfish behaviour that destroyed this young girl's life, rejecting, by extension, their capitalist attitudes and values. And purely as a means of developing that interpretation or explanation, I'm going to add the fact that Goole wants them to reject capitalism and embrace instead more socialist values or attitudes. In other words, he wants them to show more care for the poor. And let's not neglect context. Looking at this bit here, you might think, well, that's just a cheesy bit of trivia. I mean, that's not relevant to our idea about Goole unsettling the Burlings to hammer home his socialist angle. And you're absolutely right. At the moment, it's just a pointless Billy Bolton bit of context. But bear with me. And Inspector Calls was first performed in 1945 in Russia, not England. But check this out. Now we're sucking diesel. Russia was a communist country in 1945, so the play's anti-capitalist message would be well received there. Presto changeo, we've now developed that information, that factoid about the 1945 performance in Russia, and made it pertinent, made it relevant to our ideas about the play. Next step, let's spin our straw into gold. Take this plan and sculpt it, craft it, weave it into an award-winning paragraph. And here we are. You can see I've colour-coded it, so you can see how I've stitched together different bits from the plan. And I've also put arrows at the side just to guide you so you can see why I've said what I've said. Remember, the question was about the ways in which Inspector Goole has an effect on other characters. Let's read this response through, shall we? In Act 1, we see Goole seek to have an unsettling effect on the Burlings. On the state of Eva's corpse, Goole comments that the bleach had burned her insides out, of course. This highlights compellingly to the reader that Goole seeks to shock the Burlings, shock them into seeing the horrific consequences of their capitalist values, and thus accepting the merits of socialism. I think that full stop after value should be a comma. It is significant that Priestley's play was first performed in Russia, a communist country. Russia would have found the anti-capitalist message underpinning Inspector Calls to be very attractive. Now, make no bones about it, that there that you're looking at is a thing of beauty and a joy forever. Next to this, the Mona Lisa looks like a beer mat doodle. Check out the examiner criteria that I showed you at the start of this video, if you wish, just to see how my paragraph marries up with that. Right, next planning point. Again, we're still looking at the ways that Inspector Goole has an effect on characters in the play. We're going to look at that spoilt little rich kid, Eric, that drunken, self-absorbed scuzzbucket who raped Eva. And we're going to have Goole's comments on the rape. They have an impact, they affect Eric. In Act 3, Goole calls it. He says to Eric, you treated her like an animal, a thing. If you're ever lucky enough to see the BBC adaptation with David Thewlis, I mean, the contempt that drips from his tongue when he delivers this line is fantastic. Let's lay on that explanation or interpretation now. Eric realises here that he's been dehumanising the poor, seeing them as subhuman, something beneath him. And just to develop that interpretation, I've tonked in the idea that he sees Eva, he sees the poor as a plaything, really, just to use and abuse for his own selfish ends. Now, here's a high-level bit of context, because you can see the rape as symbolic. That rape acts as a metaphor for Marx's ideas about how the rich treat the poor. Because rape, you could argue, is sexual exploitation. And what it's symbolising here is capitalist exploitation, the idea of the ruling class exploiting the working class or the proletariat. So it's a very clever trick, that. Sexual exploitation, rape, standing in, representing economical capitalist exploitation. And purely in the spirit of developing my contextual analysis, I can talk about the status of working class women in the Edwardian era. It wasn't really a great time to be poor and female. It was 1912. I mean, you were denied access to lucrative jobs, you had no vote, you had no say in how your world was run. So that rape then is just highlighting or reflecting the lack of power, the lack of status that working class women would have suffered back then. And bosh, I've turned that plan into another paragraph. Now I'll spare you my adenoidal burblings, you can read this at your leisure. Again, I've colour coded it so you can link it back to the plan, see how I've kind of, built up the bricks and mortar of my argument to produce this top spec paragraph. In hindsight, I should have probably broken it into 2 paragraphs. I mean, that's a big hairy wall of words. That's going to turn an examiner off. I think where it goes grey, or maybe even where it goes black, the text, maybe that's where I should have tonked in a paragraph break. In fact, I could maybe even break it into 3, couldn't I? Oh, I'll tell you what, you'd want to be writing me into your will. Here's another final paragraph. I've left out the plan for this one, but no doubt you can work backwards using the colour coding to work out what the plan would have looked like. And you'll notice there's a little bit of orange at the bottom there. You don't have to do this, but sometimes it's very prudent or canny to kind of link your last line of your paragraph back to the question, just as a nice way of dovetailing and getting this kind of sense of closure to your paragraph. Do you know what? Forget about writing me into your will. Buy a copy of my top spec, dirt cheap book, and both of us win. And we're done. A character-based question, planned and executed, with the sort of care and flair normally reserved for brain surgery and bomb disposal. Apologies to my Irish relatives if I'm mangling the phrases here, but as they say in the Emerald Isle, slán a gut.